Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a really fascinating and highly critical analysis of EU and US crypto regulations. We'll be looking closely at the source's claims about how the financial rules of the game are being actively rewritten right now, and, crucially, who actually benefits from these shiny new rulebooks. Let's jump right in.
So the source material actually kicks things off with this super casual summer beach vibe. But it does that specifically to contrast with the heavy bureaucratic reality of what officials in Brussels and Washington are actually doing with your digital money behind closed doors. The author is basically saying, take a break from the sun, grab a drink, and let's dig into the mechanical, real-world impacts of massive new regulatory frameworks, like MiCA in Europe and the Genius Act over in the US.
Part 1. The official discourse versus the fine print. Okay, you know the drill. Whenever a politician in a slick suit steps up to a microphone, you're almost guaranteed to hear this exact narrative. They're stepping in to avoid scams, ensure transparency, and protect you, the consumer, from extreme volatility. The message is simple, right? Relax, we're just here to protect the little guy. But our source immediately calls bluff on that polished facade. While the official discourse is all about shielding everyday citizens, the reality, according to this analysis anyway, is that these regulations are actually designed as a massive, heavily fortified financial toll booth. And it's a toll so incredibly high that literally only traditional banking giants can afford to pass through it. That brings us to part 2, the regulatory funnel and the hamster wheel. The text outlines 4 very specific burdens that create this funnel. First, you've got complex banking licenses. Second, million-dollar audits. Third, giant capital requirements. And fourth, just an endless sea of bureaucracy. The author argues these astronomical compliance costs are completely unsustainable for small players. I mean, think about it. Innovative startups that actually want to offer you low fees simply can't afford the millions it costs just to exist under these rules. The result? They're forced to either shut down entirely or sell themselves to the big fish. And this dynamic brilliantly illustrates who the true winners are. Small startups with their limited funds get instantly crushed by compliance. Meanwhile, traditional giants, we're talking BBVA, Santander, JP Morgan, BlackRock, they have armies of lawyers, massive compliance departments, and billions in capital. According to the article, they are the usual suspects perfectly designed to survive these frameworks, which allows them to just dominate the market by default. So we see this massive shift. We're moving from the original promise of financial freedom right back to a good old-fashioned bank toll. The author argues the ultimate background goal here is simply maintaining the status quo. By killing off independent competition, the traditional bank you've used your whole life will just end up offering you crypto services in their own app. But, and here's the kicker, they keep you trapped in that familiar hamster wheel, dictating exactly what you can and can't buy, all while charging their usual hefty commissions. Let's move to part 3, stablecoins and control. This is the real battle for money transfer. To understand exactly how this new financial pie is being sliced up by regulators and institutions, the analysis prompts us to ask a vital question. What on earth is happening with ETFs and stablecoins? To see the full picture of where digital dollars and euros are heading, the source tells us we need to look closely at these 2 key tools, starting with the global impact of stablecoins. And here is the core conflict. Decentralized stablecoins originally gave anyone the power to move funds globally, bypassing traditional networks like SWIFT without having to ask a bank manager for permission. The government's response to that level of freedom? The source claims they hit the brakes hard, specifically to pave the way for central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, where every single cent is tracked and taxed down to the absolute millimeter. If you aren't totally familiar, a CBDC is basically government-controlled digital money where every single transaction can be strictly monitored and traced. The author heavily warns that these currencies are designed from the ground up for absolute control, completely replacing the original idea of financial autonomy with ultimate state surveillance. Which brings us to part 4, the Bitcoin exception, or as regulators might see it, the regulatory glitch. Let's break down why Bitcoin is the massive exception to all these new rules. It plays in a completely different league. It's the first, and it's truly decentralized. There's no CEO to slap with a subpoena and no corporate headquarters for the police to raid. Crucially, its mathematical code emits blocks every 10 minutes, completely regardless of what the European Central Bank or the Feds say or do. Because of this, the article highlights that it's virtually impossible to shut down. So what's the institutional response to an asset they literally can't stop?
The text argues that bureaucrats use laws to throttle centralized platforms and altcoins, but they're essentially forced to give Bitcoin institutional legitimacy. The immense, undeniable market demand has forced Wall Street to adopt Bitcoin via ETFs, and they're buying up tons of the asset simply because they have absolutely no other choice but to participate.
Finally, Part 5, Protect Your Economy. Let's look at some actionable takeaways from the source.
The author drops a pretty blunt observation here that you should definitely keep in mind. The play of those at the top is always the same: scare the little guys so he sells cheap and buys late. The author strongly urges readers not to let the negative media noise, the sudden fines, or the endless bureaucratic hurdles discourage them. According to the article, this is all a deliberate tactic designed to shake everyday people completely out of the market.
So, what's the game plan? The author outlines a very clear defense strategy. First, learn the basic concepts yourself rather than relying on a guy in a bank branch. Understand the fundamental differences between various digital assets. Diversify your portfolio, and above all, keep a cool head. Look, if the world's biggest funds are lining up at the door to enter this space, you probably shouldn't be the one running away. A massive part of this defense strategy rests on one foundational concept: self-custody. This simply means being the true, independent owner of your digital assets without relying on a bank, an app, or an office manager to hold them for you. The source stresses that you need to inform yourself about how this works, so you don't end up relying on the exact same traditional banks that these new regulations are designed to enrich. Alongside self-custody, you've got to sharply distinguish between the actual assets you're buying. On one side, you have assets driven by true mathematical scarcity, like Bitcoin. On the flip side, you have what the author bluntly calls the crypto casino, which is just a sea of meaningless, speculative tokens that lack any real utility. Understanding the profound difference between those two is absolutely key to navigating the space safely. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We'll wrap up with this incredibly provocative question straight from the source. Will you let others decide for your wallet? The author really challenges you to take the time to do your own research, learn the mechanics of this space, and take active, personal control of your financial future, rather than just handing the keys over to the traditional banking system. Thanks so much for diving deep into the realities of digital money regulation with us today. And remember, always keep questioning the fine print.